for those of you who have been with us the last two sessions, uh, Andy was asking me questions about what it's really like for researchers to be communicating members of U.S. Congress, policymakers generally, things to do, things to avoid, how to frame, all those things. And so today,
It
and
was awesome,
probably
by the way, Mark. I learned so much in those two sessions.
well, cool, thank you. And they're recorded too, so if you weren't live, you can check it out. And now I'm going to have the opportunity to turn the tables by asking Andy a lot about what he's been really focused on recently, and it's what a lot of folks are interested in. A lot of our audience is interested in, which is entrepreneurship and startups, and how do you convert or commercialize, communicate discoveries that you are arriving at or you think you may be at in the lab. And now you're talking to potential investors or licensees who want to take it to the next step. And Andy's been doing a lot of work in that area. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to start by, and first of all, any questions folks have, please put them in the chat, and we will have you get to those questions. And if you can get to those questions live, you can also put them in comments when this goes up on the Sounds of Science page and our individual pages. But I want to start by asking Andy, as he thinks about, Andy, as you think about across the landscape of these situations, these pitches, if you want to call it, what are some of the common missteps that you see, you witness?
Yeah, so I don't know if I don't know if missteps is the right word or just challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it might not be dissimilar in some ways to the policy conversation we were having before, where people are now working outside their comfort zones. So, researchers are comfortable presenting at academic conferences.
Right.
Researchers are comfortable teaching classes. Researchers, for the most part, have never done a startup pitch before. They haven't actually done a startup before. So now they're working outside their comfort zone.
Yeah,
And
mhm.
yep.
Well, I was going to say maybe the first thing, sort of question to ask about is kind of mindset, because, like you said, it's a different environment, different ecosystem, like different forces at play, different language, all those sorts of things. So, I mean, do you find that there's not sometimes maybe an appreciation, for that? It's like, this we're in a different world here, so we can't act like we're back in, at the university in a lab
Yeah.
somewhere.
It's interesting you ask that. I actually find just the opposite. Um, and it's fascinating. The intersection that I work at is the event organizers actually hire me to work with the researchers. So the researchers get this message saying, "You've won. You're going to do a pitch in 2 weeks." At a
That,
big event,
mhm.
with a bunch of colleagues and a bunch of investors and a bunch of people who've won in past years. And it's a big public event in people's hometown, right?
Mhm.
So it's like a TEDx talk to your own people.
Mhm.
So for the most part, they're nervous and they want help. And I get introduced kind of as their lifeline. So I definitely feel like um, it's a great setup for me in terms of, okay, you're going to be able to, you like, they want my help, which is great because if you're
Yeah, they
coaching
know, they
people,
realize, yeah,
they realize they need help.
yeah, they realize
And
that
that,
they need help. Okay.
yeah. So I feel
I mean,
really,
that's it, yeah, and that's a big bonus, obviously. So there's this recognition that you're the expert, and that now they're treading in territory where they're not used to, but you can be sort of their guide and give them kind of the roadmap in that
right.
environment.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
And so then, as you start to work with these folks, what are some of the things that you recognizing that you've identified a sort of common, either on, either side, good, bad, ugly.
So the biggest misstep is that they get a copy of the criteria. They get a copy of the judging criteria,
Mhm.
and it says things like total addressable market, and it says things like go to market strategy, and it says things like financial model. So they start producing these things, and what they produce looks like, a Silicon Valley pitch deck that has a competitor analysis and has a market analysis and has a timeline and has an IP strategy and has it. And each one of these slides is a separate piece of information. And I'm doing this with my hand because that's kind of what it's like. Like, here's one piece of information, crumple it up, throw away. Here's another piece of information, crumple it up, throw away. Here's another. It doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
We don't. What gets lost is the story, and that's really my role. I think, sometimes I think story finder or story hunter might be a better description than pitch coach.
Okay. Well, let me ask about this, because I think it's really interesting. Getting to this question of story. I mean, Simon Sinek has this thing where people don't buy what you do; they buy why you do it. So, is that what you're thinking when you say story? What are you thinking?
So one type of story is why. Like Simon's. So I really like that why piece of Simon Sinek, except that's not the only way to do things successfully. It's a way to do it. So one story is kind of is what I call a vision story. It's referred to me and lots of other people in this space. And that's kind of, okay, how's the world going to be different when this works? And you're dealing in the clinical innovation space. Um, it may be that you're going to solve a certain kind of cancer, or it may be, I was working with people the other day who are working on a different, they're a decision, like a woman gets breast cancer, and then has to decide, do I have a mastectomy? Do I not have a mastectomy? What type of mastectomy do I have? Because I've survived the cancer, but now what? And the now what of that story is, um, often regret of the decision because it wasn't made with good information. So somebody was
Mhm.
trying to create better information so nobody would make a decision that they later regretted. It's a very simple story, right? There's one of the ones that just won 2 weeks ago. Sometimes when they do heart surgery, there's a successful heart surgery, the valve works. The heart doctor did their job because the valve works, but the person's frail and they never recover from the surgery.
Mhm. Mhm.
And their quality of life is worse because they had the surgery.
Yeah.
So the quality of life might be longer, but the quality of life is worse. It's a simple story, right? We're not going to do the surgery if it's going to decrease the quality of life.
Mhm.
So we're going to stop making these mistakes. Um, so it's really finding the simplicity beyond the complexity. What is it that you're doing that's making either the surgeon's job or the doctor's job or the patient's life better? And a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
times, that gets lost. That gets lost in the TAM and the SAM and you know, the the competitive analysis, and it's like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? What are
Right.
we doing?
Right. Right. It's almost, yeah, maybe it's kind of interesting. You're kind of bringing it back to center because maybe beforehand it was all about the elegance of the science and the discovery, and then they sort of get the message, oh well, no, this is a pitch, you gotta, and then it goes way in the opposite direction, and then you gotta
Wait,
like bring
right,
them back to the middle in the Goldilocks
right.
option,
Yeah.
and about that, yeah, that, I mean, I guess I'm sure you bring a lot of, I mean, in addition to expertise, there's also empathy, right? I mean, this these could be muscles that aren't really, haven't been used in certain ways, for these folks who are doing these pitches. Like you said, it could be their first one. Um,
Yeah, and
so
they don't
to try,
know that. Yeah, and
yeah,
and most researchers are not. If they're used to teaching a class or they're used to doing academic conferences, they're not used to telling a story. So it's foreign space. It's like, wait a minute, I don't tell stories. I do science,
yeah,
which is another,
yeah.
like we've already had that conversation, right? Like, but people understand stories. So if you want to communicate science, you need to learn to tell stories. The other
Let
story,
I'm
the
sorry. Go
other
ahead.
story that so that's kind of Simon Sinek's story, right? The other
Yeah.
story that is different is just the origin story. How did you figure this out?
Hmm.
And the origin stories are fascinating. And they're not necessarily connected to um, the vision or the outcome but they're fascinating stories. And they're stories that allow people to then tell the details that they want to tell. So stories stories naturally create connection. You know this, right? We connect because of story. And they make us curious. We want to know the rest of the story. Like, how does this
Right.
end? So stories will do that for you. And then the good stories do a third thing, which is actually what I have. I don't know if I can play around with my camera a little. The good stories do a third thing, which is also they do what I call cradle critical details, which is the top of that triangle.
You can see it, right now. Yeah, you're
And
back down, but you
and
can see it.
what that means is they allow us to get to the research that um, of how we figured it out. They allow us to get to the impact that we're going to have. They allow us to get to the market because the origin story includes, well, what's the rest of the story? Well, the rest of the story is bringing it to market. Well, how are you going to bring it to market? Well, let me tell you my go-to-market strategy. Well, who else is in the market? Well, let me tell you about the competitors, right? So there's a very natural like, oh, okay, and oh, by the way, this is all the information that I was told I had to have in the deck, but now there's a logical progression to it. And the origin stories are just friggin' cool. I'll tell you a couple of my favorite origin stories. One of them was just 2 weeks ago, and it was this woman who was an electrochemist doing clinical innovation, and I'm like, what are you doing here? She's like, I'm like, how did you figure this out? Because she's figured out how to instantaneously diagnose something that doesn't currently have instantaneous diagnosis. I'm being particularly vague because it's not public yet.
Hmm.
Once it's public, the video should actually be public in the next week or two.
Hmm.
And I'll do a post on LinkedIn and you can hear the rest of the story. Um, but I was like, how'd you figure this out? She's like, oh, it's an electrochemical reaction. I'm like, aren't you a doctor? She's like, no, I'm an electrochemist. I'm like, the heck is an electrochemist doing in solving a medical problem? She's like, well, I hang out with doctors all the time. And she started feeling like she wasn't making a difference in the world. and she was hanging out with doctors. So she started listening to the problems the doctors had. And she's like, well, what happens if I could do this? And they'd be like, well, that would be like, you'd save more lives than I ever will. She's like talking to a heart surgeon, right? Like, well, if you figured that out, you'd save more lives than I do. She was like, oh, okay. And like 2 years later, she came back and she figured it out. And she's going to save more lives. So I think this will actually work. The judges think this will actually work because she won. And she'll actually end up saving more lives than probably any individual doctor ever will.
And she
And
was,
it's like she's an electrochemist.
yeah. And so she was bringing a completely different perspective to this
Totally
topic,
different
right?
perspective. And that's
You know,
actually how her so that's how her pitch started. Her pitch started
how
with
did
her
she
own
start it? Yeah, let's
story.
hear this. Yeah.
So
Oh, the
she,
story that
she
you told.
yeah, so she started with hi, my name is, and I'm an electrochemist. You might be wondering why I'm in a clinical innovation competition. Which is true. People are like, well, why is there an electrochemist at a clinical innovation competition? And then she told a story about, you know, hanging out with doctors and seeing these problems and knowing that these problems were solvable not through not through traditional diagnostic tools
Mm-hmm.
of like blood samples, but electrochemistry that could happen really basically instantaneously, like in less than a
Wow.
minute.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
don't have to take a blood sample and ship it out and wait a week. And by then it's too late. You got to make a decision without the information because the decision has to be made today. And the blood will take a week to get back from the lab.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, well, I think
Yeah.
I can figure that. And then she spent 2 years, like literally 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
and then she figured it out. Um, and that becomes an interesting story. And embedded in that story is the reason she's doing it. Embedded in that story is a certain amount of credibility. It took her 2 years. She is an electrochemist. Embedded in that story is, well, why did you figure this out and not someone else?
Mm-hmm.
Because every startup has that issue. Every startup has the issue of, well, someone else is going to do it. And it's like, no, because there are no electrochemists hanging out with surgeons. So a lot of the questions that people have get embedded in these origins, get answered when you start telling the story of how it happened, right? Like, who are you doing this with? Well, I'm doing it with someone who's actually a surgeon. Great. So now
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Right.
have someone who can bring this to market because they actually work in a hospital. Like, how's an electrochemist going to do a clinical trial? I don't know anything about clinical trials, but my
Yeah.
partner's a surgeon. He does.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
it's all in there if you find the right story. And that's really that's the hard part. It's really hard to find the right story when it's your story. It
Right. You don't.
almost
Yeah.
takes it takes an outside perspective. In her own
Yeah.
head, she didn't think being an electrochemist was cool. She thought being an electrochemist was a bad thing because she's in clinical innovation. It took an outside perspective to say, no, 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 no. You're going to be the only electrochemist in the entire room. Lean into that. Lean into that because that's going to be interesting to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So it's the surprising. We've talked about the how the brain is really wired to always be on the lookout for new information and learning opportunities as an evolutionary trait. That's beneficial, and so so surprise can often, well, I didn't know that, so maybe I should learn that, learn about that. So these surprising kind of even starters, too, to
Yeah.
get people immediately put in. I want to. That kind of leads into another question I have for you, which is, you know, the energy, the delivery itself. So you're talking about structure and different tools to use. How about the way you work with your scientists, your researchers when they're pitching and introducing, like, emotion and all the, the delivery stuff that we have
Yeah.
talked about over the months.
Yeah. Um, so usually when they start talking about what they've actually done,
Yeah.
they
You
come
get excited.
alive. They come alive.
Right, right,
They
right,
start explaining it.
right.
So the electrochemical reaction isn't a good one because you can't explain that with your hands, but lots of things you can explain with your hands. And you see people start to explain something and their face changes and their body language changes as they start to say, okay, you do this and then this moves so I was working with someone a couple of years ago who they were encapsulating a cancer drug in a cell so it wasn't released in your body, and then it would move through your bloodstream, and then they would shine light on it, and then it would open up and release the cancer drug.
Wow, wow.
So when you have cancer in your shoulder, your hair's not going to fall out because they're going to
Mm,
shine the light on your shoulder, and the drug's only going to be released in your shoulder.
mm, mm-hmm.
Like they do all this naturally when they start talking about what they're doing. It's when we're outside our comfort zone that we just start talking in an authoritative voice that sounds something like this because we're just trying to get through a lot of information, and suddenly we're just lecturing about something that we're actually a little bit uncertain about because this isn't our area of expertise, and suddenly we're like, that's not going to work.
Well, let me ask you this, Andy, because I know that VCs often look at the team that you're putting together, and yeah, you've got the expertise, but scientific expertise. But what about when you're talking with them? You're talking about them, about the pitch, but also, like, who are the messengers? Who are the teammates that have credibility to deliver different parts of the message?
Right. So most of the pitches are done by one person,
Hmm.
sometimes two. Um, and sometimes the two people have very different personas because there'll be a person who's more of a business, like, okay, they're going to figure it out how to get it done. There's another person who's a research scientist. So one person will tell the research part of the story, and then someone else will come in and tell the business part of the story. That
Yeah,
works pretty well.
yeah.
Um, Sometimes in the Q&A, you bring some other people up. Sometimes what I have to do is remind people that it's okay to be uncertain about the things
Hmm.
that they're uncertain.
Hmm.
In fact, that's called credibility.
Right, right.
so so they can say something like, we've looked at a couple of different go-to-market strategies, and the one that we think is likely to work the best is X. But one of the things we'd love to hear from the judges this evening, or people's reactions, is if they have any other ideas, we'd be happy to listen.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
now you get someone who's really confident about the research, they did it, and now they're not so confident about something else that they frankly shouldn't be confident about because they don't know, because they've never done it.
Right, right.
And now we trust them because they're not going to BS us.
Hmm.
Or
Hmm.
they say something like, when we raise our first round of money, we're gonna bring in We're going to bring in a CEO who understands how to bring this to market
Hmm.
because I haven't done
Yeah.
that before. So
Yeah.
one of the people this past competition is right now interviewing for co-founders. I was like, great, tell them that. Tell them that. And now we know that you're going to find the person that you need to help you get to where you want to get to. And you know you can't do this alone because nobody ever did this alone. Nobody was ever successful by themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that sort of strategic humility, I sometimes refer to it as.
Yeah.
Um, and really, there's another word for strategic humility. It's just called honesty or
Hmm.
authenticity,
Hmm. Yeah.
and those are good attributes. Those
Hmm.
are positive attributes.
Right. Right. And getting a little down that path a little bit further is, wondering, um, you know, during the Q&A. So, you have your prepared remarks, but oftentimes investors really are interested once they get a very, quick cut of what you're doing. They want to ask questions. And so, how do you handle that part of the coaching? How to operate in a Q&A situation? You alluded to, well, if you don't know the answer, don't try to make it up because everyone will figure out you don't know what
Right.
you're talking about. Other things that you counsel when you're talking about Q&A.
So I do practice Q&A with them. I ask them questions, say, how are you going to answer
Mm-hmm.
when they, I've done this enough. So I can kind of look at their deck and see the holes in it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, here's your pitch. Here are the places that the judges are likely to push back.
Mm-hmm.
So I can ask them some of the questions that they're likely to be asked. And then we start to unpack the answers together.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what is the answer to that? A lot of times, people haven't gotten to the decision in a very logical way. So they have a strategy that seems logical. But so they're like, okay, how did you decide on the price? They're like, well, we looked at what other people charge. But you just said they're not your competitors because they don't do what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So why are you charging what they charge if you're offering something that doesn't do what they do? And you don't want to be in that situation.
Yeah.
You need to have an answer to that. So anything you say, you need to have a logical response
Right.
to why you came to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be right, but it needs to be thoughtful and logical.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you too, Andy, about, there the presentation is putting forward this amazing new discovery, and the market looks like it wants this, and at this price point, everything looks great, but of course, things really don't usually unfold exactly the way you've got them sketched.
Yeah,
And
things
so
go sideways.
things can go sideways, and the investors have heard all these rosy predictions, and sometimes they want to know, like, well, what happens if this doesn't work out, or you don't get
Yeah.
the patent, or you don't, and how receptive are your researchers as you're working with them to be able to answer those questions honestly and comfortably.
Um, so I think this is the other side of the confidence coin. So there's
Hmm.
some things that you should not be confident about, and there are other things that you just have to be ridiculously overconfident about. because that's what it's going to take. So sometimes the answer is just, I'm going to figure it out, or it's going to work. They're like, well, what happens if this doesn't work? And you're like, it's going to work. I've done the research and it's going to work. And they're like, well, what happens if it doesn't? It's like, that's like asking me what happens if there's no gravity tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just,
Yeah.
it's inevitable. If it doesn't work this way, we'll figure out the way it does work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that like mindset of, I'm gonna make it happen. Because you have to have both. You have to have a little humility around what, about where you need help and what you don't know. But you also have to have kind of a little bit of a crazy confidence that it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even though no one else believes it. Even though no one, like you just, and, we have that conversation, right? We have that conversation of, when is the right answer? I'm going to figure this out. What's plan B? There is no plan B. We're going to make it happen. Because at some level, you're not going to get an investment unless that's, there's some questions that's actually the right answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the trick is to figure out which one's which.
Right. It seems like in that kind of situation, if we're talking about really the science, um, that's an area where your researcher, I mean, that's home turf,
Right.
a bit. So I could see how the credibility there is like, look, we can do this a variety of different ways, and we know, this one's probably the most promising it's going to happen. But if gravity were
Doesn't another
suspended
one will.
tomorrow, we figure another
Right.
one. Yeah. We're right up against time. I think there's a lot left to talk about here, and I probably merits that's taking me to the next step and doing another one of these. But you and I will figure that out. But there's still a lot more to talk about in terms of getting researchers ready to present and pitch in an environment that's very very different.
Yeah. I talk about this stuff forever, so you don't have to.
Yeah,
I'm
and
like a wind up toy in this space.
yeah. Well, you've had a
Um,
lot of success there,
yeah.
and that's all to the good because these are discoveries, that need to get out there that are going to make a big difference, and improve lives and save lives. And I think maybe next we talk about this, maybe talking a little bit more about what makes something innovative versus just, that word is thrown around a lot.
Right.
And you let off by talking about this chemist who was involved with the surgeons, and I think that's where a lot of times real innovation happens, where you get these disparate perspectives that are stitching things together in completely novel ways, and that's so exciting. That's
Yeah.
that's how you move things forward. So
All
I
right.
mean,
So let's call
I
it
can tell.
let's call it a wrap, and we'll see people again in 2 weeks, same time, same channel.
All right, this was great for me. I loved it. Thank you, Andy. And thanks, folks, for being here live. And you can also watch it on the